Welcome to the best and quickest setup guide for Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. I have a considerably more detailed video about the controller setups if, at the end of this video, you're not 100% clear what it is you're supposed to be doing, but I am convinced that this tutorial will suffice for the majority of you. What do we need in order to fly an aeroplane or a helicopter or any flying object in Microsoft Flight Simulator 24? Well, nothing more than a single Xbox controller, really. Of course, the more devices that you have, rudder pedals, yokes, throttle quadrants, or HOTAS systems, then the more realistic your flying experience will be. Regardless of how many devices you are using, the new setup system in Microsoft Flight Simulator 24 will work the same way. Today, I am just going to be using an Xbox controller in order to emphasize this fact. So, first of all, connect your controller or controllers to the PC and head into the control menu. Here on the left column, you should be able to see your device listed. If you do not, then make sure it is turned on, connected properly, and if that doesn't fix it, then you might need to restart Microsoft Flight Simulator 4. If you have duplicate inputs, like 2 yokes or 2 throttle quadrants for example, sometimes only one of them will be visible, and a restart should fix that problem as well. However, once they're both there, you'll notice that they are both called exactly the same thing right now. This is a bug that I hope Asobo will rectify fairly soon. The first thing you'll want to do is to select your aircraft. All inputs are now bound by aircraft, a feature that we begged for in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, and it seems that Asobo have listened and really delivered on this point. Okay, so in this screen you can see aircraft grouped by type: airplane, helicopter, glider, LTA and other. What is so cool about this is that all airplane type input controls are kept separate from each other, which really helps keep things tidy and organized. So go ahead, search for your chosen aircraft in the search bar or filter, or just look through what's available and then configure it as you want, and then click save and back until you return to the control section. So when you can see your controller in the left hand column, left click on it and ensure that there is a small tick in the bottom right hand corner. This indicates that this is the device you are about to edit. You should also see an image of your device in the bottom right, which replicates the device you are using. Microsoft Flight Simulator 24 controller setup has changed for the good, as controller inputs are now split into 3 sections and they are bound to each individual aircraft. The 3 individual config files are general controls. This is where non-flight inputs are recorded. Camera view, flashlight controls, playback management, walking around, all of those kind of non-aircraft specific controls. Then we have airplane controls, and as you might expect, this is where we store everything needed in order to control the aeroplane. We also now have specific controls, another thing we were desperate for in Flight Sim 2020. These only relate to the aircraft selected at the top of the control page. They are specific to this one aircraft, but they can also be copied and shared with multiple or all aircraft if you wish. A good example of this is your rudder pedals. The chances are that your rudder pedals will be expected to do exactly the same thing for all aircraft, so you could copy and paste them across the board. So Asobo and Microsoft were good enough to provide us with a default configuration for some controllers. Now the naming convention usually contains the date 2024, so if you have one, then you could literally be ready to fly straight away. Let's dive a little deeper. As there are a lot of controls and inputs in this game, in order to help you navigate more quickly, you could click on the filters option at the bottom left of your screen. Click it once, will switch to assigned and will only show you inputs that are already configured for your chosen device. Click it again and it will switch to essential. This is useful when setting up a controller without an available preset, or if you just want to start with a completely fresh or blank config file. Now there is a bit of a bug here for some aircraft where nothing will show at all. Hopefully they'll fix that soon. Click it a third time and that will remove all filters and return us to where we started. There is also a search box, and to the right of that search box is a search by input button. Click on the search by input button and press any button on your selected controller. It should now list all of the inputs that include that button that you just pressed. That is, unless one of the following is true. Nothing is actually bound to that button. you have chosen a controller without a preset, or you have changed either or both of the general or airplane preset config selections to none. Or perhaps you're just experiencing that bug that I mentioned a moment ago. Now the final option to help you search is of course the search box itself. Type toggle parking into the search box. You do not need to hit enter as it will search as you type, and it's pretty quick too. Whilst we're here, I'll quickly show you something really quite cool. Now, because you can only edit the controller that you have selected, remember the white tick in the corner that I mentioned before, trying to bind an input to a button on a different controller will issue the message wrong input. Now, this is a huge improvement over Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 because now you can switch to any other controller, let's say keyboard for example, and it will not lose or reset the search that you have just made. So you can very easily now bind this other controller to whatever button you wish without having to search all over again. This alone will save us so much time. Okay, switch back to the controller that you started with and let's get going. Now, you cannot edit any of the presets, but you can copy them, rename them, and then edit those config files. Let's edit the airplane controls first. So, you can either click on the cog next to the preset that you want to edit and click duplicate. At this point, you'll be asked to name your new config file and you'll have the option to apply to all aircraft, set as default, or choose both of these options. If you set as default, this will make this new config file the one which auto loads every time you pick this aircraft. Or rather, that's what it should do, but right now there's a bug. I'll show that in a bit. So, if you click apply to all aircraft, this will then copy this new config file to all aircraft of the same aircraft type. If we quickly go back to our search, you can see the tag airplanes. This is very important. If you do click apply to all aircraft, it will only apply to all aircraft types, not helicopters or gliders, etc., just the airplanes. If we change the search a bit more and set it to just toggle, then we can scroll down and see that every single input has two tags, a type tag and an input type tag, which is either digital or analog. The type tag can be aeroplane, helicopter, glider, or it can be general, because it's an input from the general controls tab. Remember, these are the non-aircraft control inputs, turning on a flashlight, jumping in the air, walking around outside of the aeroplane. You may have also noticed the specific tag. Now, if an airplane has any specific controls, then you will also see specific tag inputs. At the moment, most aircraft do not seem to have a preset specific config file, but this one does. So let's change this specific input config file. Let's search for door. Right now, I'm going to add the A button from my Xbox controller to be this input. And you can see that we get forced to create a new config file. This is a new specific config file. So let's call it spec test. Set it as default and assign to all aircraft. Now let's search for flashlight. Again, I'm going to assign it to button A on my Xbox controller, and again we have to create a new config file. This is because this is an input type of general and not specific, so it's a different config file altogether. So let's call it general test. Again, we will save to all aircraft and set it as default. Finally, let's search for magneto. Let's again set it to button A on my Xbox controller, and again we must create a new config file because this is an aircraft config file. Let's call it test plane. Now you might have noticed the incremental number next to the input. Now this does appear to show the number of times this button has been used prior to this use, and I think it's possibly buggy. Now it makes sense to show how many times it has been used in total, but if I check this later on, and I'll show you this, but I believe this is buggy and not saving our inputs at the moment. It's a big problem, and definitely Asobo need to fix it. Okay, so right now we have 3 new controller inputs. All three have been copied to all aircraft and have been set as default for this aeroplane. So let's switch to any glider and see what we have in there. So as you can see, and perhaps expected, the general config file that we created has copied over, because the general config file is applicable to all aircraft types. But neither of the airplane specific files have been copied over, and that's because they are of the aircraft type and not glider type. So then let's switch to any other aircraft. And we can see that both general and test plane have indeed copied across, but not the specific config file. Of course, that is because the specific config file is specifically the Cessna 172 Skyhawk and no other aircraft. Let's go back to the Cessna 172 Skyhawk right now. So you can see that all three files are there as we expected. Now when you click on the cog and open this mini menu, it seems at first that there is no easy way to close it down. You can't click away from it and it closes or anything like that. One option is to click one of the available options in order to close it. From the cogwheel menu, you can duplicate, rename, apply to all, that's if you've made changes, clear all inputs so it's completely blank, or you can delete the config file completely. To close the cogwheel, you can either click on duplicate and then just click cancel, or click on one of the arrows in order to change the config file available. This is probably a bug because it makes no sense to do it this way. So, all three of our create files are now set to be default. Let's test that. If we go out back to the main menu and come back in again, we can indeed see that these files are loaded by default. But if I change them and go out and come back in again, you can see that the file it loads are not those which were set to default. And in fact, the files that have loaded are not set to default. So I think this is possibly a bug. Now there's a chance here that if we left the game completely and loaded back in, something I can't be bothered to do right now, then it would load the correct default files. So just watch this space and see what happens there. Right, we're almost done. There's only a few things left to show you now. In order to delete a button input, if you want to delete a single button input that is, you do not click your mouse on it and then press back on your keyboard, because that will identify as the wrong device. It will recognize that the back button on the keyboard is not the device you have selected to edit. Instead, you simply hover your mouse over the input button that you want to delete and press the back button. Now be careful with this because there is no confirmation at all. It will just delete it. Right, finally, let's discuss advanced input features. Hardware settings. Down in the bottom right hand corner, this is where you can tweak and configure your axis inputs, sensitivity and dead zones. Right now, it seems to be completely broken because that little white dot in the middle is meant to move as I move my joystick, but nothing is happening. So this is an area that needs to be fixed. It is also worth mentioning at this point that if you have a switch input, like a proper up or on or a rocker switch input, in order to bind the button, you need to switch it to both on and then switch it off again. And this will, at that point, add it as an input. It's like a button. You just press it and release it in order for it to action. Now, the eagle-eyed of you may also have noticed a cog on the right side of all of these inputs. This is the advanced input control. Now, it's far too complex to squeeze into this tutorial, and it's probably a bit buggy. So there's a lot to discuss here, but a simple example would be if we set the control to release to active. So set control on release to active. Now, pressing a button down and holding it until you want to drop the bombs, for example, at which point, when you're over the target, you release the button, and when you release that button, that's when the signal is actioned, and it will drop the bombs when you release the button, not when you press the button. Finally, let's delete these three inputs. And that's it, guys. Pretty straightforward. If you've got any questions or you want to say thanks, which would be greatly appreciated, please do so in the comments section. Don't forget to like, don't forget to share, and subscribe if you would like to see more. I hope this helps you out, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Till then, take care. Goodbye for now.